Ladies and gentlemen, recording live from somewhere. We are back. Acquire and operate Micro SaaS. We're doing it for the love of the game. For anybody that is new to the program, we are buying and building a portfolio of enduring niche vertical SaaS businesses. And we are doing it, as I already mentioned, for the love of the game. We're doing it in public as well. Thank you for riding along. Today, of course, got my partner in crime here, Kay-Lou. We are hitting an acquisition concept. Obviously, we've been just kind of bouncing back and forth between acquisition and operating concepts, given where Scaling Ventures is in our life cycle. So not a lot of deal teardowns, not a lot of other stuff. So hopefully this stuff is substantive and you're following along and that it's useful. I have a sense that today's topic, which the headline here is simplifying the most common legal agreement for buying and selling a micro SaaS firm, aka the asset purchase agreement, is very useful because it's dense. So what to expect today, we are going to be talking about, firstly, what the hell is an asset purchase agreement, and A, and B, why are they common in micro SaaS firm acquisitions? So that'll be some very kind of table setting, context setting, point of departure. Then we'll get into the simplest definition of an APA. And I guess moving forward, when we say APA, that's shorthand for asset purchase agreement. And then we'll dig into the meat and potatoes of the core components of an APA. Kay-Lou, how's that sound? I'm already like, oh God.
Yeah. I'm sure you can see me bouncing. I'm like, ooh, when we get into those meat and potatoes,
oh
baby.
Boy.
Mouthful.
Yes. And so like the assumption, like this is, or, I guess some of us have bought houses. Most of us have signed like an employment agreement. So think an asset purchase agreement is the thing that gets the deal done. It is the document that formalizes the actual transaction, the purchase of the business or the assets of the business. And we'll dive into that. So I guess the assumption is that very few of you are JDs, very few went to law school. And so with that, we need a grasp, a level of competence around legality and legalese so that we're not, to give us a better chance of success. Obviously, you need a dope lawyer in your corner, period. You need a dope lawyer and an accountant, regardless, because those are professional services and they're highly skilled, highly trained and educated folks. But you don't want to be the layman that's just completely lost the entire time.
ChatGPT
Yeah. So the hope here is to give you a vocabulary so you're on the same page and to simplify the living bejesus out of this whole thing.
Well said.
Sound good?
Well said.
All right, let's jump in. So we got an asset purchase agreement. So there's two real flavors of kind of the legal thing. You've got an asset purchase agreement, which we're going to be leaning into because that's the most common in our market segment. And then you have a stock purchase. So the first question is like, okay, so I want to buy a business. You've really got two options. So let's dig into kind of what the distinctions are between the two. So in an asset purchase, or I guess this in a sentence, asset purchase agreements allow buyers to select only the valuable parts of a business, avoid unwanted liabilities, and there are potentially some tax advantages. So they're very often, that's why they're very common. So I guess instead of being like Kevin Lewis LLC, I'm like, hey man, I'm going to buy Kevin Lewis LLC. I'm going to buy all your stock. And you're like, okay, cool. I've got this on a credit card. This other dude is suing me and I'm in litigation right now. And so you're going to have to handle that. And it's like, oh man. And there's motives on the other side, but we'll keep it very simple. An asset purchase is like, yo, Kay-Lou, I want to buy your website. I want to buy your Instagram handle. I want to buy your customer list. I want to buy your blah, 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 blah. I don't want to touch that credit card debt or any of the other weird debt, and good luck in court.
Yeah, you're essentially picking and choosing the parts that mean well to your bottom line, that matter to your bottom line.
Yeah, and guys, it can be a little bit misleading where you're like very selective about the assets. That's less common. Right. You're usually buying all the assets, but you could say, hey, I want to buy all this stuff, but I don't care about your social media handle because it's you. And that I can't get any value from that. So we'll carve that out and let's cut the purchase price by 20.
Said another way, it gives you a chance to better negotiate the liabilities that you don't really want to deal with, but knowing you might still have to acquire them anyway.
100. So asset purchase agreement is more anchored. And then we'll get into how that's kind of misleading because an asset purchase, there's some other stuff that you're kind of buying implicitly. But hopefully, point of departure, you're buying a business, you've got really two options, an asset purchase or a stock purchase. Asset purchases are very common in our market space because buyers don't want to assume liabilities. They don't want to have exposure to kind of unforeseen legal risks. They want to buy the assets of the business. And then you're like, all right, but these are software companies. You don't have factories. You don't have inventory. You don't have equipment. You don't have any of that stuff. It's like, okay, like the kind of usual suspect assets are the code base, the customer contracts, the vendor contracts, the employment contracts, the website domains, the email address, lists.
If there's any patents, those come along.
Yes.
Any approval regulations with like local authorities, those relationships come along.
IP assignments, trademarks, and all that. Like it's very rare that there's IP in the mix even, but you're like, isn't it code based IP? And it's like, yes, but it's not a patent,
but it's
not a trademark. You can patent some stuff because a lot of people are like, but there are no assets in a SaaS. There are no tangible assets in a SaaS business.
It's all digital,
so they're all
assets.
intangible. That's what you're buying. So we'll kind of build on that. And now let's move into what an asset purchase agreement kind of implies. So you have the assets, which we just went over, but then you have a series of promises. And the legalese for this is representations and warranties. So this is basically like, I am representing these financials for the business. This is what the P&L looks like. I'm representing these are the clients and they're active and they're paying. I'm willing to guarantee that there haven't been any security breaches in the last 12 months. So you have the assets, which is the stuff that we just talked about. And then you have this series of promises, which are essentially what you're representing and the things that you're guaranteeing about the state of the business, and how you kind of establish standards around what the human's buying. And then lastly, you have a thing called covenants, which are basically agreements. So everyone's head's already spinning. So you buy the assets. If I'm on the buy side, I'm buying assets. I'm buying certain promises from you and certain guarantees, and I'm buying agreements. And the most common agreements or covenants are that you're not going to compete with me. I'm not going to buy the business from you, and you're going to stand up a competitor and come after me. And that you're not going to solicit my employees. You're not going to solicit my customers. Stuff like that. So legal stuff is like, all right, it's assets, reps and warrants, and covenants. For the normal human, it's the assets, which are the code base and stuff like that, a series of promises and a series of things that the seller is agreeing to.
Man, almost like the original digital NFT, but with more complications.
Oh yeah, it's like, boy. All right, so now we're gonna get into some juicy juice. Okay, so what are the core components? And I'm gonna share my screen on this one because you kind of get a sense for what we're looking at.
And you can find like these templated APAs online. I mean, we did a ton of research, and while we're gonna show you the structure and walk you through it, it can get pretty intense. So thank the gods for acquire and operate.
Yeah, so let's zoom out.
Yes.
So the good news is we only have to cover this much shit. All right, so we'll take it. And some of this stuff is very basic, right? So, but it's so funny. I mean, or it's just, and so another interesting thing, there's a saying that 9/10 of the law is about ownership. So and most of that started with property. So like, I have a deed to this land. My land comes here. So it's about defining who owns what and how they can defend what they own, how they can seek damages if somebody pees in their yard. That's a bad example.
If you build a fence too far past your limit, yes.
So I think so much of it is about own, and at least, I guess the legal system is pretty ancient. So we inherit a lot, or it's one of, the founding fathers were all kind of lawyers. So the Constitution is a legal document, right? I mean, it's all kind of, but that's where you get stuff like preamble and recitals.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, Jesus, like, do I have to sign anything on that? Like, what does that even mean? So that is an introduction.
We'll just setting the stage.
Yeah. And so the preamble is like, this is a asset purchase agreement. It's dated on this date. It's between this person and that person. The background is like, this is an exchange or an acquisition of the assets of this software company. This software company does this and that. Then you have some definitions, and this has had a huge influence on me because, oh God, the best way to avoid confusion is to agree on the definition of terms.
Yes.
In any context. So that's why with a lot of my posts now, I'm like, let's first define terms out of the gate. And it's just a useful practice no matter kind of what your context is. So the definitions would be like, purchased assets. buyer is this person, seller is this person, boom, boom, boom. And it's like, cool. And then that's half of it. And most of this legal stuff, like you want to leave as little up to interpretation as humanly possible.
Yep.
As soon as this stuff becomes subjective, you've achieved nothing. But there is stuff that you really can't wrap containers around.
Yeah.
So the definitions, and if you're kind of reading one for the first time, start with the definitions.
Yeah.
I know that's not like, it's like, hey, great idea, dude. And it's like, yes, start with the definitions. Make sure that you're clear on the language that you're speaking.
Yep.
So anyway, that lists all the important terms and what they mean.
I wanted to add one more honorable mention to that. So we've been building in Publix for, let's say, a year or more now. And for those that are watching that have been following along, if you're already building and trying to scale your own portco, that same operating model that you've been developing has standard operating procedures. Part of your standard operating procedures is an introduction where it shows the purpose of the doc, and you immediately go into definition. So everyone internally at the company knows exactly what a lead is, what a customer is, what a trial user is. So you're just taking that same thought process forward into the APA. If you've been, following the best practices all through while scaling the company, this area should be a cakewalk for you.
Same thing. Totally. Well, yeah.
Air quotes.
Maybe.
How hard can it be? Right?
Yeah. Okay, so now we get into the meat. So there's the purchase and the sale of the assets, AKA, and all these headlines are going to come with an AKA, which is the high school translation. So purchase and sale of assets. What's being sold? So the purchased assets, it's going to list the things being sold, as we touched on, code base, vendor and user contracts, social media handles, whatever. And this is not as common. It's going to list excluded assets.
Yep.
So it's not like, hey, I'm buying this stuff. And because like the assumption is that you're kind of buying all the assets unless you're like, except for this. And you need to be very discreet about like this, or explicit rather, about the excluded assets. Assumed liabilities. So this is going to list like the debts or responsibilities that the buyer is taking on. And more often than not, it's ongoing contracts, accounts payable, and certain employee obligations. It's very rare that they're going to buy any debt obligations or buy, stuff like that. And excluded liabilities, the most common one is like, I'm not going to pay the business's taxes and I'm not going to pay their debts. But it's like, okay, but you got to state that
You
stuff,
literally
right?
have to state that stuff.
Yeah. And then we get into the purchase price and the payment. And that's like, all right, how complicated can that be? And so you have the purchase price, which is the most straightforward. I'm going to pay you $1 million. The payment terms is where it gets interesting. It's like, I'm going to pay you $1 million. 80% or 800K is in cash and 200K is going to be debt. Or like there's a wide variety of that, but it's usually cash, debt, and then maybe some performance-based thing, which is called an earnout. So the simplest payment term you could ever see is, I'm buying the business for $1 million, or screw it, $100 million, and it's going to be all cash, baby. It's like, oh, cool. Next one is, I'm going to do $100 million and $50 million of it's going to be debt. And we're getting debt from a bank or whatever. Or it could be like, actually, you're going to issue us the debt. And this is called a promissory note. So let's go back to $1 million because that's easier, even though 100 million is more fun to talk about. So it's like, hey, Kev, I'm going to buy your business for $1 million. I'm going to, on a closing day, or in terms of the payment terms, I'm going to give you 800 grand cash. And then the other 200K is going to be a loan from the bank. Cool, great. Example B, the other 200K is going to be a promissory note, or what's called a seller's note, because you're giving me a note, and a note is basically a document that is basically says, I'm agree to lend you this money. You're going to pay me back in this amount of time at this amount of interest. There might be some contemplation about prepayment penalties, stuff like that. So if we walk through an actual scenario, I'm going to pay you 800K cash, 200K in a seller's note. I'm going to pay you back over 5 years, and I'm going to pay you interest only for those 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, I'm going to give you a balloon payment of 200K. Cool. So that means that now I only need to show up with 800K, and I have the 7 years to pay you that remaining 200K, and I just got to show up with the interest on an annual basis. And then I'll just wrap with one last thing. Yeah, the last one is like an earnout. So this is a performance-based thing, right? So it's like, I'm going to pay you $1 million. 800K is going to be in cash. 200K is going to be in debt. If the business grows 100% in the next 2 years, I'm going to pay you another 200K.
I see.
So the earnout hooks you in with skin in the game,
right?
Because and maybe on your side you're like, dude, but I'm selling prematurely. I know the business is going to continue to rip. It's like, okay, then do an earnout.
Yeah.
like that's a great way to do it. Where it's
if
like
you're very bullish on the idea, very bullish on the company, do an earn out. Yeah.
Or if the buyer needs your involvement to continue what's happening. So it's a little bit of a handcuffing instrument as well. But anyway,
I think that can work, especially in scenarios where folks are so attached to the idea. They see the company as their baby and they don't want to be fully removed from it. And they're open to working with whoever the new seller is. And earn out is an amazing idea.
And again, that's on the buyer's point of view. It's a good way to de-risk it.
Right.
Where it's like, we're buying it under the assumption that growth is going to continue in this direction.
Right.
To give us assurances, I'm going to incentivize the seller. Where it's like, dude, if we hit that 30% growth target that you have, I'll hit you with a $200K bonus.
Dude, let me ask you a thoughtful question for myself and the listeners. Outside of identifying what assets you might want to grab out of the business and then valuing those assets, would you say most of the rest of the time is spent on the payment terms?
Or there's an old saying, I'll pay you or you can determine valuation if I can determine payment terms.
So most of your time is spent here.
So 1,000%. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's hard to say which is which. Like, it's like valuation is obviously the point of departure for the whole thing, but the cash at close is really the thing.
Yeah, that's
so
what you're
it's
signing
like,
on.
I need to show, because that's where you have to rally. That's what you have to figure out. There's debt financing and stuff like that. But I would say there's way more levers. Like the purchase price, the valuation is a number. The payment terms, you have like 4 or 5 levers available to you. So there's way more space for negotiation. So that's why most of the negotiations focus on that.
That's what I wanted to pull out of you from just watching and being shotgun with you. I'm like, hey, let's say that for the users. It's like, this is where you're going to spend most of your time, but this is also where you have the biggest leverage. So lean into it.
Yeah. And like most common scenario for us is 20% cash, 10% seller note, and 70% debt. So obviously we like leverage. Some people don't.
Yeah.
Leverage is risk, but that's where you save that for another day. So or I think if you talk to the acquire.com crew, they'll tell you a lot of times it's a third, a third, a third. A third cash, a third seller note, a third earnout.
Right.
The thing that you need to be woke to if you're thinking about an SBA loan is that the SBA hates earnouts. Hates earnouts. Okay. They like seller notes a lot.
I think we need to have a follow-up call around this, because I was going to say, once you mentioned the 70% debt, I was like, we need to have a call to then defend that, because I'm sure people are listening and they're like, well, why the heck would you do a deal like that? Right?
Yeah. Well, think about a mortgage.
True.
So is anybody buying a house all cash?
It's all debt.
Hell
and
no.
It's better to get the
5% down. Right? It's like, cool, I'm going to buy $1 million house. Here's 50 grand. I'll pay you the rest over 30 years.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you're building up equity. You're having a lot of other things that you can use as an asset, as levers in the meantime. Yeah. Just working off that debt.
But if you don't pay your mortgage, or if you run out of cash and can't pay your mortgage, you are SOL. So debt
service
like
coverage.
If you run out of cash to service your debt, it's catastrophic risk. So that's the downside of debt.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh man, I bought some equity and the company went to zero. Okay, bummer. Man, I took on a loan and I can't pay it. Oh God, there goes your credit score. You got bankruptcy at risk now.
Personal guarantees,
it's a different
collaterals. Yeah.
Collateral. They come take your shit. So it gets real.
Yeah.
Anyway, but let's just, there's a reason they're called LBOs, leveraged buyouts. Almost no one calls them just BOs. They're LBOs, man. Everybody's using leverage to some degree.
Yep.
Final thing to touch on here is there's a thing called escrow. So what this is around payment terms is basically like what I'm trying to prevent is, Kev, you're great, dude. Here's the $1 million, send me over all the stuff. And you're like, nah, have a nice day. Got my $1 million. See you later. And I have no recourse, or vice versa.
Right.
You give me access to everything. And I'm like, cool, this is great. See you later. And you never get your $1 million. So the escrow is this trusted thing that sits in the middle.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I'm going to put the money in here. And then once you give me the stuff, I'll signal to you and you move the money back. And they'll move the money over to you. So it's this third party that kind of is a trust mechanism that makes sure that nobody gets screwed in the deal.
Similar to purchasing a home. You put it in the middle with the escrow and the broker.
100. All right. So now into representations and warranties, AKA promises, which is a commitment, and a guarantee, which is like I guarantee this. And if there is a guarantee, there's some kind of recourse. But anyway, seller's promises are assurance from the seller about the business. It's mostly that like, these are the actual financials. We are compliant to do business in these markets, blah, blah, blah. Buyer's promises are basically that they can get the deal done. So they're like, I have capital to get this done. I'm, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's kind of a survival period. So I'm making these promises, I'm making these guarantees, and after 3 years, you can't come after me if I break any of my promises, right? Or any of the guarantees aren't valid. So there's like a survival period. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. Then we move into covenants, aka agreements, and you have covenants that are before closing, which is like, I'm not going to, disrupt the business. I'm not going to, what's another example? But I guess to keep it simple, you have agreements that are applied before closing, like what both parties need to do before the sale is final. And then you have after closing, which is what both parties agree to after the sale. Like most common, as I mentioned, are non-competes, not soliciting employees and customers, stuff like that.
Yeah, and then just like you said for the common ones, a real life example that you see happening all the time, it's like those major mergers, someone just saying something, the deal gets out, now boom, the whole entire deal falls apart because one executive.
Yeah, so ton of it is non-disclosure.
All non-disclosure.
It's like I'm not going to tell anyone that you're looking at the business. Yeah. I'm not going to let anybody else look at the business. A lot of times that's in the LOI, but
yeah.
Anyway, so that's that. And then we move into caps and baskets. And this is basically putting a container around the risk. So if you think about it in insurance, right? So it's like, okay, let's go. All right, no, sorry, I jumped way ahead to caps and baskets. My bad. Sorry.
No, you were there. You were at
actually,
covenants.
Sorry, I wrote about it twice. So caps and baskets should go under indemnification. So sorry. So let's jump. Sorry, I need to delete that. All right. So we just touched on agreements. The most important one if you're selling the business is that I'm not going to compete with you and I'm not going to come take your employees or take your customers. Then we move on to closing, which is a closing date. This is when the sale is going to be completed. And then the closing documents, which we will talk about in exhibits as well. But these are the documents that need to be exchanged, like a bill of sale, payment receipts, stuff like that. So now we get into indemnification. And it's like, all right, God, and I want to keep recapping. So we've got assets, we've got reps and warranties, aka promises and guarantees. We have covenants, which are agreements. And now we have indemnification, which is basically how you handle problems. So indemnification is like explains how the parties will handle any losses or problems that come up after the sale, which is mostly if you break a promise. So it's like, hey, I promised this, I broke my promise, I will owe you X amount of money. Cool?
Makes sense.
And it's pretty straightforward.
Yes.
The caps and baskets are what wrap containers around X amount of money. So the simplest one, a cap limits the total amount that the seller's on the hook for. So it's like if I break this promise, or if I break any of these fundamental promises, the most I'm on the hook for is the purchase price of the company.
Right.
So you can't come after me in excess of $750K, $1,000,000, or $1 million, whatever. Right. Baskets is kind of like a deductible in insurance. It's like, if let's say I kind of broke a promise, you can't come after me until that cost gets above 30 grand.
Any cost that you incur as a result of me breaking a promise. Got it.
So I broke this promise, Kev, you're pissed, but it only cost you 10K. Sorry, dude. The basket's at 15K.
Yeah, that's on you.
Like
deductible.
That's on you. So it's kind of like when does the problem actually become real? And what is the ultimate scope or scale of the financial kind of risk that I have to owe you if something goes wrong?
Right. That makes total sense. Yep.
And I'm just gonna delete that. Right. Meow. See ya. Okay. Cool. Conditions to closing. Pretty straightforward. It's gonna be like these are the things that need to get satisfied to close the transaction. Like the big one is absence of material adverse changes, which is basically like the business doesn't go absolutely haywire and the performance totally shits the bed. It's like, okay, like that's fair. We won't close the deal if the business, 50% of our users churn, whatever. Termination is very important because at this point, for sure, if you're on the buy side, you've incurred costs. So you paid someone to audit the code base, you've paid a lawyer to draft an APA, all this other stuff, just like with a house, right? Where it's like, you can't just walk away at this point. Like there have to be, basically there has to be, these are the defined reasons that where you can end the agreement. So those are called termination rights. And it's basically the circumstances that allow you to be like, deal's off. Because at this point, both parties have invested and you can't just be like, actually, I've gotten cold feet. I don't want to sell it anymore. Or, ooh, I found, I'm not sure I want to buy the business. It's like, nah, dude, you can only kill the deal for these 5 reasons. And that ain't one of them.
Right.
The deal proceeds. Cool.
Good. Yep.
All right. Miscellaneous provisions. Okay. It's basically like, this is going to be governed by Delaware. This is, whatever, that's the governing law. Dispute resolution, notices who gets information, how do you send it to them, and then the entire agreement, which is so funny, but it states that this document is the complete agreement between parties, which sounds frivolous, but at the end of the day, it basically defines that this is the thing. And if you attach something to it, it needs to be amended, and there's a whole process for it. But this agreement represents the agreement, so no one's confused.
Right.
So actually, as I say that out loud, that's really critical. But it's funny that it's like, this agreement is the entire agreement. It's like, yeah, I read all 35 pages. I got it.
Yeah, it's also like the like the preamble that we started with. It's like, hey, this is going to be an agreement between these two parties, and then you get to the bottom. It's like, now this is the entire agreement. Welcome, you've arrived.
Yeah, exactly. So now we get into the exhibits. And so what are the exhibits? The exhibits are almost like an appendix, or they're totally like an appendix.
Yeah, appendix.
Where you have the main thing, and then you have the appendix, which is a level of detail that is an appendix.
The due diligence.
So it's like, all right,
all the documents.
Or it's like, here's all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it's like when the thing mentioned the vendor contracts, here's the exhibit that lists out the vendor contracts.
Mm-hmm.
So it basically adds a level of detail for the avoidance of doubt. There's some legal jargon for you.
So you should like a data room, like a Google Drive folder where you put all the stuff.
Yeah, but there's like literally like hard copies of stuff in the document that everybody signs.
True.
So the first one, which is so funny, is the bill of sale. Yes, you get like a receipt of some kind when you buy a business.
Yes.
And this is basically the official document that transfers ownership of the assets to the buyer. You have an assignment and assumption agreement, which is going to go over the contracts and responsibilities that the buyer is taking over. And then you have the schedules, which is probably the most analogous to the appendix term, where it's like, here are the assets, here are the liabilities, here's all the important information, yada, yada. You have an intellectual property assignment. This transfers ownership of things like patents and trademarks. You have the transition services agreement, which is basically says exactly what the seller has committed to do to help you step in and take ownership of the business, make sure everything's smooth. You have the non-compete, which we've spoken about. Maybe there's a promissory note. Back to our example. Hey, Kev, I'm going to pay you $1 million, 800 in cash. Here's 200K in a promissory note. This is the actual promissory note that says I'm going to pay you back over the course of 5 years, interest only, and I'm going to pay you 200K at the end of 5 years, or I'm going to pay you interest and principal for 5 years, and the thing will be totally paid off in 5. Again, a lot of flavors of that.
Yep.
Consents and approvals are proof that the necessary permission that like you can do what you said you're going to do. You have the right to sell the assets, that there's no weird claims on any of the assets, yada, yada. And then employment agreements if the buyer is buying some of those.
Or he.
Shoot.
So let's say for the kind of dealing, especially in micro SaaS, you're not really going to get a lot of regulators in play unless it's, like in health tech or pharmaceuticals or biotech or something like that, right?
Well, there's all kinds of flavors of regulations, right? But obviously, or what would typically happen is like like an acquisition will be proceeding, and then it'll be reviewed for antitrust.
Right.
Where they're like, but what you try to get that review before you, because it's like, hey, we've in a big kind of corporate context, it's like we've spent $20 million
exactly
on the deal on this acquisition, and oh my god.
But you don't really hear stuff like that with micro SaaS, though. That's what I'm thinking.
No. I mean, yeah, there's very little. I mean, it's like, dude, you got to buy every micro SaaS company in a category. It's for antitrust. It's got to be monopolistic.
Exactly.
Like, there's got to be a lot of stuff. There's other stuff where it's more like, oh, you like. I mean, there are really, but another example would be like, oh, you said that you had a permit. Like, what would be an example?
Okay.
Is like, yeah, like you said that you had a permit to run a campground in this place. You don't. And I just bought the campground in this place and it doesn't have a permit, so I'm not allowed to operate it.
Yeah.
You screwed me.
Or like we were looking at like parking lot businesses that made them digitize, or vending machine businesses that made them digitize. It's like, hey, you need licenses to operate in certain locations, you know?
Exactly. And that's more on the user level, but yes. So that, I guess to answer your question, it's very rare that there's a ton of approvals and regulatory considerations when you're buying a SaaS company.
Got it.
Almost none.
Yeah, just wanted to validate that, because I could assume and say like, no, I haven't seen that, but just wanted to validate from your experience as well, like how often you're seeing things like that. But it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
Cool.
Holy smokes. 30 minutes and 26 seconds we were managed to jam through that. So let's just do a quick recap.
Yes.
Micro SaaS acquisitions. There's a legal document that formalizes the acquisition. There's two versions, an asset purchase and a stock purchase. Asset purchases are very, very common in our market segment.
Yep.
When an asset purchase is not just about the assets, it also includes a series of promises that you're making and a series of agreements that you're making, or that you're buying if you're on the buy side. And these documents are complicated and you need a dope lawyer.
Yes. Man. So just treat like any contract you've gone through with buying a house or any major asset where you just had to spend a ton of cash on in buying it from someone else. This is an asset purchase agreement. So spend a ton of time, or spend some time learning it so you can at least understand what you're getting into. But yes, hire a very good lawyer to just make it all make sense.
Yeah. And I guess and I should have mentioned this at the top, they are very favored to the buyer, or very biased to the buyer, obviously.
Yep.
And so it's usually the buyer's responsibility to provide an asset purchase agreement. So be on your toes. If I'm sending you the contract, it's going to be in favor of me in every single way. So you have to kind of come in with that assumption and also understand that that's kind of generally the context of the game. And the good news is you kind of can invent the wheel once. So get a dope lawyer, shape what you like as an asset purchase agreement. And that can very much be a template that is a point of departure. So you don't have to start from scratch every single time, obviously. And that's about that, man. I think we've kicked that horse to death.
I was gonna say, boom, baby, like that's it.
Yeah.
Learn what you can, get a good lawyer.
Yeah, and I guess on the other side, like if you get to and it's like, and I guess to put this in the context of an actual acquisition, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, like your business, I've done some valuation work, and then you sign the LOI, which is basically the purchase price and the payment terms. Here's my intent to buy the business for $1 million. I'm going to pay $800 cash and $200K in debt. I want 90 days to do final diligence and execute the asset purchase agreement. Cool. Now you're under LOI. Things are going great. Boom. Now you get hit with the asset purchase agreement. The beef of the remainder of that is you negotiating the asset purchase, and then you get to closing date. Bang. Deal is done. Now you're into seller transition, and then you're into the Holy Land.
Dude, that was impressive. Take a deep breath. That was impressive.
Yeah. So, but I guess where I was going with that is that if you're negotiating an asset purchase, you're close, baby.
Yeah. You're like, so you should be
jazzed. Yeah, you're there. Or you're red zone. You're proper red zone. Even though I'm the worst football fan of all time. But anyway. All right, Kev. Always a pleasure, my G. Laser beams.
For the love of the game.
For the love of the game. I will enjoy your vacay, my guy, and I will see you next week.
Until next week, I'll come back with some beach photos for the users, or for the listeners.
No. Yeah, sandy and salty, my friend.
Sandy, I love it. Salty. All right, player. Take care.
All right, y'all. Cheers. Peace.